sovereign defaults are at an all-time high. We had 14 in the last 3 years versus 19 in the previous 20 years. That's 4.7 per year now versus less than 1 per year previously. That's an increase of almost 5x. We have millionaire migration to the US has dropped by 86% in the last 3 years. And central banks are buying a ton of gold. The chart is ridiculous, presumably because they see that something is coming. So it's like, okay, you are the
you actually missed a few.
I know.
You got a lot. You missed a few.
I cut out like 10.
Yeah, so there's an insurance crisis. There's the fiscal crisis. Blue states are bankrupt, like California, Illinois, places like that. They're losing a lot of money. There's the auto loans. There's the student loans. There's credit cards. Each of these are like $1 trillion problems that could crash the economy, and they're all happening essentially at the same time.
It is insane. So I feel like we're standing on this really rickety thing. You said that the economy is beginning to creak. But I've heard you use an example before that I worry is more accurate. Now, remember, all I care about, I want people to look at this. Neither of us have a crystal ball. The one thing we are guaranteed to get wrong is timing. I just want everyone to be very clear. Now, the wins and losses all come around timing. So, of course, like if I had a crystal ball, I would just shut the show down and just go make a lot of money. So, I have no idea when this is going to happen. So, to be very clear, but you've used an example before that I think is absolutely brilliant. And that is, this is a Wile E. Coyote moment.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So, Wile E. Coyote, if people haven't seen it, you can probably put up an image of it. This character from Looney Tunes, and they walk off a cliff and they're just, merrily going in midair. Then one day they look down, they're like, oh my goodness. And the markdown is digital in a sense, right? They just fall all the way straight down, right? And if you look at the graphs of some of these bank stocks, they're kind of like that, where they're analog, and they're just kind of floating through the air. And then suddenly somebody actually looks at the financials, they look down, and they're just digital, they die overnight.
That analogy is so apt because, and this is why I never know how to handle these moments, because by talking about it, you are getting people to look down. And so in some ways, you run the risk of speeding it up. So you talked earlier about Janet Yellen. She knew there was a problem, but she didn't speak up. Now, for people just listening, he just made a face. Yeah. So we're going to get to the face in a second. But You've got Janet Yellen who knows there's a problem, but doesn't broadcast the problem. But I don't know if I'm mad at her for not broadcasting the problem. But at the same time, I can't help myself out of a moral sense of obligation from telling people, hey, you might want to look down.
Why make the face? Well, the reason is, that line of argument that talking about it is causing it is actually, people throw that around. I think it's false, but it's false in an important and interesting way, which is when one of the things I've found that's, I think, a stupid kind of meme is you talk about this type of stuff, people be like, oh, you're such a doomer, you're such a downer, just look on the bright side, man, blah, 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 that kind of thing, right? And, the goal is to be neither a pessimist nor an optimist, but to be just a realist. And if you're a realist, then you're not a Pollyanna, right? Like, it's not a doomer to say, oh, there's a wall in front of you, you might want to turn the car. That's just being smart, right? It's being realistic. And the thing is that what happens when you talk about this stuff, in the absence of another human being there, the negative emotions that people have out of visualizing what a deleveraging actually is are projected on you. Oh, oh my God, you're causing a bank run, et cetera. Who caused it is Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve and Janet Yellen and the U.S. financial system, but especially Powell, because he's the chair of the Federal Reserve. Why does Powell hate America so much? That's actually the question. Why did he, devalue the treasuries that the government had sold in 2021? Why did he tell people that interest rates were going to be kept at zero before totally, jacking them to the moon? Why did he say that inflation was transitory when it wasn't, right?
I have a slightly different hypothesis, which is all the things you just said are true, that the actions that are being taken are being taken by those people, and those actions are creating the problem. But my whole thing about it's the debt that causes this collapse. I don't think any human, any group of people is a better way to think about it. I don't think any group of people can stay emotionally sober for long once they've lost sight of the people who built the thing. So once you've had enough people that have inherited the country working well, you now just it is guaranteed to devolve into these choices that happen around debt. Because again, we talked about this earlier. It's coming from a beautiful place. They want more people in housing. They want to make things better for people. They want to elevate people, lift people out of poverty, make sure that, nobody goes without. Like, it really does. Like, I understand the, what you call the wokening, I think, the wokening of America. Like,
the Great Awakening. It's not my coinage.
The Great Awakening. Whoever came up with it, I get it. I get the impulse to it, but the problem is that you get in this debt cycle of, let's inflate the currency. Let's print money. So we're printing money, we're inflating the currency. And look, yeah, kind of cheeky. It does devalue everybody's money, but nobody feels it too badly. Like, honestly, that in 2008, I was like, word, like, print money, man. If that's going to help people, that's amazing. I got devalued, obviously. And then again, SVB. I didn't have any money in SVB, but I was still like, word, yeah, print. So I'm just like, wait, is this much ado about nothing? Or is this the cycle that humans cannot get themselves out of? And I'm as much of the problem as anybody else, because I'm like, I don't want to see people suffer, man. If you can print, I guess we all take a hit. But it's like, when does it become a problem?
Okay, well, so first is, there's something called the Cantillon effect, okay, which is to say, and I think some people have an intuitive grasp of this, but I'll explain it anyway. Printing money is, in a sense, like official counterfeiting. And the guy who got the counterfeited dollar first can spend that and get more of the purchasing power. And then eventually it makes its way through the system and the entire money supply gets marked down. And it's got less of its purchasing power with the 15th guy who's got it, okay? And so printing is not costless. What printing just does is it's like, basically, inflation is taxation. It's like, let's say you had, I don't know, $100 billion, okay, in the economy as a whole. And then the government prints another $100 billion. That's as if the government seized 50% of the wealth in the country. Does that make sense? Or at least 50% of the savings?
Yes.
Because
and I don't know how intuitively this comes to people, but yes, once you get it, once the penny drops, it's brutal.
Yeah. So inflation is taxation. That is to say, and printing, especially when you're printing a large percentage of money supply, it is essentially centralized seizure of wealth. The difference is, if you think about the difference between like a in-your-face predator that's like communism, or like a lion, you can see it coming, versus a stealth predator that's camouflaged like a snake, that's like Keynesianism. Communism, they would just go to your house with a gun and they would just shoot you and take your farm and throw your children in a gulag or whatever, right?
Very direct.
I mean, that was a lived experience. That's a lived experience of many people in Russia, China, Vietnam, like all kinds of people. That's what collectivization was, okay? But Keynesianism it steals the money in a much more subtle way, where a button is hit and it's like a mosquito. You don't even feel it, right? The blood is sucked, or it's like a camouflage snake or something like that. You're dead or bankrupt or devalued at the end of the day, but you might even feel it's helping you. So, for example, let me show you in particular a very important graph. Did Republicans pay for 2008? So let's revisit. First, take a look at this graph, okay? Have you seen this graph before?
Oh, yes, my friend. I told you. Every graph you've ever put out, right. I think I've seen.
Okay.
It's probably not literally true, but it's very close.
Okay, all right. Well, that's cool. So there is a Wall Street Journal article that this comes from, okay? And it's actually like an animated version, so you can play the animated version that goes back and forth, so you should do that. Point is, what is this graph showing? Basically, it is showing congressional districts in the U.S. by their real GDP, okay, inflation-adjusted GDP. And what you can see is the kind of solid line, blue line, and red line. In 2008, Democrat and Republican congressional districts were mostly evenly matched. That is to say, both of them had rich districts, both of them had poor districts, and the median real GDP in both the statistics was comparable, okay? 10 years later, by 2018, the distribution of Democrat, districts had pulled away from the Republicans. Like the median GDP of Republicans was like $30 billion in their congressional districts. For Democrats, it was like 50 billion or thereabouts. And moreover, all of the wealthiest congressional districts were suddenly Democrat. So essentially in 10 years, this massive gap was opened up between the two parties. And this is how you went from the suit and tie wearing Republicans of the early 2000s to the trucker hat proles of the late 2010s. And that transformation happened over the life of most of the people who are watching this. But I believe it happened in part because the printing went disproportionately to the coasts. That is to say, if you track the Cantillon effect, if you track the flow of printed money, well, it's a Fed. It buys these overpriced mortgages from banks. The banks now have extra assets on their books, and they can spend it on financial assets. And then those people have money in their bank accounts, and then they can go and spend it on houses or goods or whatever. But that's disproportionately in the coasts. The money went to Washington, D.C., it went to New York, and then some of it made its way to Silicon Valley. Venture capital is actually a tiny fraction of the overall investment landscape. It's like a few billion versus hundreds of billions of dollars. But like a small rivulet of that printed money made its way out to Silicon Valley venture capital. And that was probably like the most productive use of the money, because you're talking about investing in businesses that are being built from scratch. And that's a whole separate story as to what happened there. But essentially, the money made its way to the coasts, and the guy in Oklahoma, who's some cashier in Oklahoma, got the printed dollar last, and didn't even realize that they had been devalued, and that they had been essentially had a good chunk of their assets seized, and their whole town had their assets seized. And the thing about this is, the whole time, as you just said, people are like, well, we're helping people. The Fed saved the world, right? Well, what it actually was, 2009, 2016 as a Democrat administration, perhaps it was just a coincidence that the Democrats became far richer than the Republicans in 10 years, okay? But it does seem like the cost of the print was imposed on the political opposition in a deniable and invisible way, unconscious even to those doing the imposing, who would actually say, we save the world, we help people, stimulus, blah, 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 right? And that's like a camouflage predator, where it's like anesthetizing its target that doesn't even know the blood is being drained. Okay, that's being attacked. It's like, it strikes like this, right? And that's actually better because, a lion gets your fight and flight response up. It's a predator. Mosquito doesn't. It's done, and you don't even maybe detect that it's happened, right? And so it's like, we see that evolution has selected for the camouflage predator, and that's a lot of what the financial system is. And if you think about this, by the way, and you just start relating, think about how many times banks try to get one over on you with fine print, right? Fine print is not a tactic, it's a strategy. The whole point is to get somebody to sign a contract that they didn't fully read, or they didn't understand and parse the legalese, and lock them into some adjustable rate mortgage, or some student loan where they're too naive to understand, like how bad it is for the rest of their life when they're 18 and they don't, they're not taught interest rates, they're not taught taxes and stuff in high school. They're taught just a bunch of gibberish, and then they sign a student loan for the rest of their lives. The system is sort of set up to get people into debt. And to be clear, I'm as capitalist as they come, but I do believe there's asymmetric information arbitrage there. And that which you've seen at an individual level that the financial system does is also something it does, in my view, at a collective level. By the way, there's somebody else who paid for 2008. You know who that was?
No.
Potentially the Arab world. And the reason is basically food price spikes helped trigger the Arab Spring, right? The U.S. exported its inflation. Remember the whole Arab Spring in the early 2010s? Right?
I do very much. And this is going back to your earlier thesis for everybody listening along. As you, Balaji, as you fractal into these ideas, I want people to understand that there is an anchor. There's something that triggers this for you. But like the second, third, fourth, fifth order consequences, in hindsight, can be seen. And so a big part of why I find your thinking so interesting is you're like, hey, look backwards, understand what you're going to see going forwards. Basically, once you understand that inflation is taxation, and that Republicans paid for 2008 and with their money, and unfortunately a number of people in the Middle East paid for 2008 in part with their lives, because people are like, oh, 2008 financial crisis wasn't the end of the world. Well, you know what?
for the Arab Spring, it was the end of a lot of people's world, right? Libya was plunged into chaos. That inflation did destabilize countries. And even if you say it's only 20% of the cause, because it's multiple causes, and I'd agree with that,
Balaji, will
that's
you walk me
20% of a lot of
through
chaos.
how did that happen? I actually don't understand how the inflation, we didn't really feel it, not in like a way that broke us, but it caused actual instability in other countries. What happened? What's the mechanism?
So food prices are the often discussed mechanism. That there was like a fruit vendor who set themselves on fire that helped, Mohammed Bouazizi, right? Fruit vendor set themselves on fire, and that is thought of as what triggered the Arab Spring, right? Like essentially, his prices, December 2010 would have been a normal day if the local, prices, if the prices hadn't changed, right? And so the thing about this is, it's multifactorial. There's a reason that the government, and media covered it at that time and whatnot. It was useful in the sense of, have you seen that clip from Wesley Clark where he talks about how even in the early 2000s, there's folks in the military industrial complex that had decided to invade like 7 Arab countries. Have you seen that one?
No.
Wesley Clark's former 4-star general, right? And pretty senior guy. Before the Iraq invasion, that the U.S. planned to attack 7 countries in a few years, and actually a lot of that came true, right?
Oh my God, I did hear this, and they asked him why, and he said, "I have no idea."
There were a bunch of these folks in like the Project for a New American Century, who essentially thought that Islamic fundamentalism was a huge problem, and they need to democratize the entire Arab world with like what they did to Germany and Japan, right? That's like the good motives version of it, but of course, good motives. You know what I'm saying? It's like let's call it that is probably what their internal mental model was. Like, yes, It's terrible that war exists, but it was terrible that World War II happened, and Japan and Germany are better off for it. So we need to conquer the entire Middle East and democratize them so that their women are free and whatnot. That was the narrative of the early 2000s. Okay, What happened, of course, was just absolute mayhem and chaos with ISIS and many of these countries destabilized, and Libya in civil war.
But is that what destabilized people? That feels more direct. I'm still trying to understand how 2008 the Arab Spring, we inflate the currency. Why does that impact their food prices?
We don't have a blockchain where I can show A purchase B from C and so on. I mean, markets are complicated, but the U.S. exports its inflation in part because it is the consumer of all these products around the world, and the dollar is its major export. And what is a small or tolerable rise in prices in the U.S. is intolerable abroad if somebody's like kind of living hand to mouth. To give what I could diagram out for you, by the way, is like the exact sequence where it goes from the Fed buying an asset from a bank, which then has a cash and can buy a stock, which then puts money in the hands of an investor who can buy a house. That's actually something where you can probably track it through the financial system to track exactly how the print of money is bidding up. You ever heard the saying, the price of tea in China, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? What does that have to do with the price of grain in Libya? Okay. To track it exactly, you need access to several different databases that are not public, So you have to kind of look at the aggregate stats and say, okay, here's how the U.S. exports inflation. And then people will argue about that. Part of the point is that it's meant to be deniable, right? But the concept of the U.S. exporting inflation is certainly not my innovation or anything like that. That's something a lot of folks have talked about. So if you want to get mechanistic about it, you probably have to go and pull data sets from, several different grain vendors and so on. You see, okay, this guy suddenly got a print of money, and so he bid up X, which bid up Y, which bid up Z, which bid up the prices of this guy in the Middle East, right? But that X, Y, Z, A, and B are hidden because they're not on chain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right, and that's actually part of the point. The part of the point is the mosquito, right? The camouflage predator. The point is that you can't see it, right? The point is that that's not public. I mean, think about how much more coverage we we got of Kim Kardashian or whatever in the 2010s, then where did all that printed money go? Hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. Where did all that go? I mean, how many articles have you seen? Is it a daily thing on that, a breakdown of where the printed money went? If you know that inflation is taxation, then one option is you can just stay in the system, like those Republicans, like those people in the Middle East, and those folks who are near the money spigot, who can benefit from the Cantillon effect, do another print, and they benefit again first, right? But if you see it coming and you get out first, now you're not part of the base that is diluted. If you get out to outside money, you get out to gold, you get out to Bitcoin, you get out to maybe a foreign fiat, now you have an asset where, to go back to that example, let's say there's $100 billion and the US government prints another $100 billion. It seized 50% of dollars, essentially, right? But if there's 21 million Bitcoin, the US government cannot print even one Bitcoin. So it can't seize the Bitcoin. Does that make sense? Right?
By stealth means, yeah. I'm not in the camp that Bitcoin is unseizable. I think
that's true.
You lock somebody up, they're going to real quick be like, all right, here it is.
Yes, but basically it's not easily centrally seizable. You have to go back to communism. And this is actually very important. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies more generally increase the cost of seizure. Okay, because like a SWAT team costs money. It's like what are $40,000-$50,000 or whatever, right? So now you have to actually look at the P&L of going and kicking in somebody's door and beating them up and taking their private keys, right? And you have to you have to find them. You have to find you have to have like some legal authority to go in and beat them up, and then you have to replicate that. And that'll arouse resistance, because now it's no longer the camouflage predator, it's the lion, right? It's something that you can actually see. And that causes
I don't want to derail us on that part yet. We're going to get into that, which I think is a big thing with the network state and all that. But the question I want to ask before we move on, I think this is very important. So Chamath Palihapitiya, sorry. So I don't want to misrepresent his views, but I think he's incredibly bright. And he has said many times, and Chamath, forgive me if I'm getting your idea wrong here, but basically that the debt to GDP ratio is a big nothing burger, and everybody gets their pennies in a twist as that number gets bigger, and we've got multiples of GDP in debt, and he's like, nothing's ever going to happen. It doesn't matter. There is no upper bound. What do you say to that? Is there a breaking point, or can we actually just keep printing money basically forever?
Well, Chamath is a colleague and co-investor, and I've been on All in a bit, and I think we have a cordial relationship. Chamath has also said, put 1% of your assets in Bitcoin just in case, because if everything else goes to zero, then you know what? Like, they can't dilute that. So, if you asked him, I don't know where he is at numerically on that, but he probably, I don't know if he'd say it. There's 100% probability of no devaluation. He's a sophisticated investor. He probably hedges. So that's the first counter argument. Many people, it's a point about not seeing something in one's life. Let me make the point a somewhat different way. Most of the 20th century, most people in the 20th century saw an economic apocalypse of some kind. It was communism in Russia, in Eastern Europe, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Cuba, right? It was Islamic fundamentalism in, for example, Iran. That was also, asset seizures happened there. That's actually why a lot of Persian people made their way to LA. A lot of the entrepreneurial class, their assets were seized in that revolution. There was socialism in India. There was currency devaluations in Latin America, all the kleptocracies, and Argentina was once a rich country and it became poor in part because of these kind of currency crises. And certainly there, even the UK had huge problems after World War II to pay for all of that. And so I think there are three countries. Dahlia talked about this. There's only three countries that compounded through the 20th century without an economic apocalypse, and those were the US, Canada, and Australia. And so you have this interesting combination of three facts. First, economic apocalypse is actually fairly common. Second, economic apocalypse is uncommon for Americans. And third, economic apocalypse is uncommon in American media. And instead, the one thing that we are aware of is, the potential for genocide on racial terms, right? That is definitely a threat. That's something you should be aware of, right? But actually, most of the conflict in the 20th century was not on the basis of just race; it was on the basis of class, right?
Do you think Americans have to worry about that?
I do think so. Yes, and the reason I think so is, if you're not like immunized against something, I mean, in many ways, I think this century is seeing sort of a flipping, okay, where those countries that were on the capitalist right in 1991 and the communist left in 1991 have essentially shifted sides, where now they're on the cultural left and cultural right. And one of the consequences is all the countries that had suffered through socialism, communism, and so on in the 20th century, even if they still call themselves communist, like Vietnam or China, they're done with that in a sense. Like, they're not. I mean, there's bad things that the CCP is doing, but they aren't like fully abolishing capitalism and going back to Maoism. That would make them too poor.
What do you think they learned that made them flip that leaf?
Generates power. I mean, that's like
capitalism.
I like to be really blunt about it. I mean, basically, you have an economic machine, and you can. It turns out letting people self-organize generates more wealth and power than not, right? That's if you're just totally cynical about it, right? And of course, it also generates more contentment among the population. Eventually, you can get from a position of totally enlightened self-interest to, okay, it's more stable than the alternative. If the people are, have a good standard of living, they're not going to protest. You can run the government or whatever, right? By contrast, if the other side is, if you have been born rich. Have you heard that, saying like shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations?
Love it. Yeah.
It used to be an old American saying, right? So the current generation in the US has been born to wealth, right? They're born, a lot of people who've come to majority have essentially inherited this giant superpower with this scaled economic system and so on. And they didn't have to work for it and fight in wars. They didn't have to earn it. And so the memory of what it took to earn it has fallen off. So it's the opposite of those, who grew up under socialism, grew up under communism. You're not, like in India, for example, which is actually rising and doing quite well on balance nowadays. Nobody's like romantic about 15 years ago. It was much worse. Life is getting better there. Infrastructure is improving. Technology is like a good thing. Capitalism is a good thing. And in general, not without its ups and downs, but things are generally up and to the right. And by contrast, in the West, I think they've forgotten what's got them there, and it's a combination of, we can spend without having to produce. You've heard the concept of the resource curse. You know what that is?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, so like the resource curse, it's like many countries that have oil actually find that people just end up fighting over the oil, or the money is spent in a bad way, and so on and so forth, right? It's like you don't have to earn it or what have you. I'm not saying all, like Norway used to seem to manage it. The UAE is managing fairly well now, and so on. So it's not 100%, but it's like it's something that can set you wrong. And so there's a huge difference between founding and inheriting, not just for an individual, but at a country level. George Washington, founded like the U.S. military, right? There was some, like Hamilton founded like the ancestor of what's the Federal Reserve. Those guys understood the constraints in the world, as opposed to the 37th mayor of this or the 42nd president of that. Like those are folks who, inherited something. They're just like, they were named into a system that was going before them and then continues after them. In the same way that like the 15th CEO of GM or something like that is so far distant from the founder. Sometimes you get somebody who's like Satya Nadella, who's like, who manages to make their way to the CEO position, but has the DNA of a founder. That's a very unusual kind of person, because to make your way to the CEO position, you sort of have to be a conformist and rule follower and so on. And then to reinvent the whole organization, you have to have the founder DNA. So it's unusual that it happens. It's not, it's zero probability. But right now you have a machine that's the opposite of, like, in India or China, within living memory, they were communist or socialist or very poor. So you don't take it for granted. Whereas we will always see people saying in the US is, of course, we're number one. We'll always be number one. We inherited being number one. I can't believe you're saying we'd never be number one. It's not hungry. And by the way, even, like, a great example is the response to superpower competition. Remember Sputnik? Right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, probably before right? So when Sputnik, the Soviets launched, Sputnik, the US response at the time wasn't, oh, the Soviets have demographic problems, they're going to go to zero. You're a doomer. Are you just repeating Soviet propaganda by talking about Sputnik? You loser. Why don't you believe in America? Blah, 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 blah. Instead, they're like, oh boy, these guys are ahead. We need to get back ahead. Massive math and science, effort. We're going to put a man on the moon in, before the end of the decade. Like, rising to the challenge and treating your competition and taking them seriously is actually how you win. As opposed to the response to Soviets couldn't be more different than the response to China, which is a combination of denial and actually stealth imitation. So it's denial. It's like, oh, you're saying, China's going to go to zero. They obviously suck. We have the Mississippi River and they don't. So they're, what I'm talking about. The people who will argue these, like, again, I've got nothing against them. But,
demographics, man. For example, on the way out. It's done.
Yeah, exactly. The demographics are done. They have terrible geography. They don't have a blue water navy. They can't feed themselves, and so on and so forth. Just to kind of go through these points, because people will raise them a lot. First, should I talk about that for a second? Right?
Yeah, please. This to me gets into why we're in trouble.
Yeah. So first, just looking at the graphs, maybe put the graph of steel production, okay, and then put the graph
insane.
It's insane, right? So you see this graph, and what you can see is anybody who's making an analogy to the past saying, oh, it's just like the 1970s and the U.S. was in a malaise, but, we pulled it out and so on. The U.S. was making 10x the amount of steel of China in that period, and now it's the other way around. China's making 10x.
Why steel, Balaji? Why do you focus on that?
Well, it's just, you can look at tons of other stuff. You can look at basically every raw material, or not every raw material, I should say, every manufactured thing. A variety of different graphs look like this. And
the reason I think steel is interesting, exactly, it's emblematic. These guys are playing to win. And look, I'm in California. If I had to do the last 3 years over again, I probably would not be in California. There's just a growing sense of like that trying to win is bad and that you shouldn't want to be competitive. You should want everybody to win. And I'm like, no, I'm here to win a championship. I want to be the best. I want to play with people that want to be the best. And so when you look at China and you're like, they're going to collapse, like, we don't need to respond like we responded to Sputnik. I'm like, you're going to lose. Like, you've got to be in this game to win. Now, you do not need to love to crush your enemy and hear the lamentations of their women, as they're driven before you. That's not my vibe. But my vibe is very much like the reason that steel is interesting is these guys are building things. Now, are they building too many things? Are they building things that they're going to like knock down? Maybe. But one thing I've heard you talk about, which I think is really insightful, is that that thing that, man, if you're of my age, when you hear that idea of, Pearl Harbor, I think we awoke a sleeping giant, and like, this is like a fatal mistake, and the US comes and just like manufactures, and we do this unbelievable stuff, and we're able to build this Navy and Army, like unbelievable. We end up doing what we do in World War II. Absolutely incredible, amazing. But now, like, if we had that same moment now, I don't think we'd be able to manufacture our way out of this. We've outsourced all of that manufacturing. And so now we're in this different period where culturally people don't want to be dominant. They don't want to be aggressive. Like, that's seen as like bad mojo and, it's toxic masculinity or whatever. And I'm just like, oh my God, like I need to be around people that want to go hard. I want to be around people that want to win. Like I want to be around people, and look, this is going to be a little naive. So please look past this. I'm just trying to explain like my spirit of competition. I don't look at China and think, oh, I have to beat them and they're bad. I look at China and I go, all right, China, I see you. I see what you're building. I see that you can build a train station or whatever it was in like a night. Not joking, by the way.
Yes.
It might have been 48 hours.
You saw that video.
Yes, it was so fast. I was like, this is insane. And in the US, California especially, like you can't get a bathroom stall put in. You've shown this, like cutting the toilet paper ribbon for a bathroom stall. It's like, guys, what is happening? And so getting back that energy of like, I want to go against the best. I want China to be as strong as possible. As somebody who has read Mao, The Untold Story, I am so happy for them that they have moved away from that and that they're coming out. I want a formidable opponent, but I want to be sharpened by that opponent. I want to get better because they're trying to outcompete me. And so I want to outcompete. Like I want to rise and do better. And look, I don't want to go to war. Trust me when I say I don't want to see them impoverished. That's not how I envision this. But when I was a kid and it was like us versus Russia, and it was like they were doing cool stuff and we were trying to do cool stuff, it was like, okay, that felt good. Like it gave me a sense of pride in my team. It gave me a reason to want to get in there and do well. And because of the way that I'm wired, I didn't want to crush my opponents. I didn't want to see bad things happen to them, but I did want to win. And like that spirit is just going away. I already know that the comments now to this section of the video, people are going to be like, oh, this fucking guy. But I'm telling you, man, you need that spirit.
So there's a few things which I think of as cope whenever you mention China that are worth addressing, right? One of them, immediately, when people will come with a psychological defense, will be like, oh, China can only do that because they're a communist dictatorship and we're a free country, so that's why it's messy and that's why we're slow at building and so on and so forth. Okay. Except, I mean, you know, if you believe America was a democracy in the 1940s, it could build a bomber in, you know, like a day, right? Actually, no, here's the stats. What is it? B-24 bomber, the source, Ken Burns, says 60 minutes to build a B-24 bomber, okay, which is crazy,
my
right?
God.
And that is, of course, that's the average time, right, in terms of, you know, how many were being built per day, right? B-24 Liberator long-range bomber, one came off the line every 63 minutes, okay? Like, now, today, it takes, you know, so World War II America could make a B-24 bomber in 60 minutes. 2022 America needs 20 years to reopen a bathroom, okay, in San Francisco. And the thing about this is there's actually two different demographics. Because one demographic is the one you just mentioned, which says that they don't want to win. They want, like, all these environmental impact reports or what have you. The other demographic is one who's like, okay, yeah, we need to do industrial policy. But they're sort of, it's like LARPing, right? Because they are trying to do it with printing and spending. They're like, wow, spending on factories is up and to the right. But you know what? Industrial policy is like venture capital, and simply spending the money doesn't mean you'll get the returns. It has to be done in a capital efficient fashion. And I'm not seeing that, right? I'm just seeing money thrown around without constraint and without accountability and without a CEO. And so I'm very bearish on essentially industrial policy right now. Okay. It's like saying you're going to do venture capital. There's a difference. You're doing it well. Coming back up a little bit, the point is, if the US was a democracy in the 1940s and China was communist in the 1970s, it was much more communist and genocidal then. And so if the argument is, oh, they're a communist dictatorship, that's why they could do it. Well, why weren't they? They were even more communist then. If you're actually arguing that gives them strength, it doesn't, because they were weaker 50 years ago, right? And the US was stronger, and you'll argue it was still a democracy, right? So that actually blows up, in my view, that kind of cope style argument that, you know, it's because they're, you know, evil, that's why they're strong. They were actually much more evil, arguably, 50 years ago when they were killing millions of people during the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution.
Yeah,
and now
if anybody's
I'm not saying
arguing against that, I think that's madness.
Yeah, so I'm not saying they're good, like in the sense of I don't like the social credit system and, you know, the surveillance, you know, state they've built and so on. There's many legitimate critiques, but they're not as murderous as under Mao, right? There's actually an improvement, you know, like it's
seemingly by a country mile. But if everybody has a North Star, which is human flourishing, I will say that, yes, I don't think humans will flourish as well, even under the current regime. I just think that social credit scores and things, it just plays out in a way that breaks people's spirit. I think that part of what allows for human flourishing is freedom, but I am not deaf to Ray Dalio's take, which is, look, they are a different society. They have different values. And so
Yes.
Once you realize that the people could rise up at any point, and they don't, so there is something going on there. It's not bad enough for them to drive them to revolt. Now, maybe it would be. If the US suddenly we woke up and we were like that, there might be a lot more pushback. So anyway, I can simultaneously hold multiple ideas in my head. I would not want to live there. Does not seem like the thing that's going to lead to maximal human flourishing, but I agree with you very much, having studied a limited amount, but having done at least some studying of Chinese history, it's like, whoa, it's a lot better than it was back in the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, just way, way, way better.
Yeah. So one thing also, by the way, and this is controversial, but I'm just going to bring up these two articles so that people can at least see them. The thing is that it is true that China has, some have charged that China is being very, either it's genocidal or it's cracking down or it's concentration camps or something on Uyghurs in Western China. That would be the counter argument. The thing is that the U.S. was bombing, Chinese Uyghur militants and, once jailed them and now defends them. You can see these articles from Foreign Policy. So here's NBC News 2018, U.S. targets Chinese Uyghur militants as well as Taliban fighters in Afghanistan. U.S. once jailed Uyghurs, now defends them at UN and Foreign Policy. So the thing is that at one point, the U.S. and China were both thinking of what's going on there as, quote, counterterrorism. And there's a woman named Sheena Greitens that has written about this, right? And then it's kind of totally switched sides, right? This is not to defend anything that's going on there, because I'm sure it's quite brutal. But it's like Sheena Greitens on understanding China's policies in Xinjiang. This is in, the belfercenter.org. Okay. And essentially, like, she's saying that China is talking about that as, quote, war on terror, very similar to how the U.S. justified its interventions in the Middle East. The reason I say this is it's like, okay, that's useful to know, because it's just not talked about. One thing I find is, all the negativity towards Russia and China is, there's something merited there, no doubt, but it's also something which some people think it's like, being super nationalistic and being super jingoistic and having a big war is just what the country needs America needs to get back together. A big war, that'll bring us back together, a common enemy. I've actually seen people make this point. Have you heard that kind of thing before?
Of course.
Right. So the thing about that is that's not necessarily true, because if there's a big war, I mean, if you think about COVID or 9/11, like the war on terror or COVID, that didn't bring people together. That just, immediately got politicized. And, if there's an alien invasion, one side would side with the aliens, almost certainly, right? Like, that's just the dynamics of how polarized it is. And I think, even though, quote, China is a bipartisan issue now, it's questionable as to how long that lasts. We'll see. And it's a bad thing, by the way. It's like, you can't build America by hating China. You need to love America or love other Americans. And you see my graph on it's not one country, it's two parties.
Yes, dude, this is one of the most troubling things you say. And I'm saying that in the context of, I know you're saying that we are potentially facing financial Armageddon, but so going back to my rogue wave interpretation of your thing, and I should explain that to people. So rogue wave happens when you have a bunch of big but not destructive waves. They come together at once and somehow their amplitudes magnify, and it will create this rogue wave that can topple an oil tanker. And that feels like, when you look at the collapse of an empire, usually they do not die from without, they suicide from within. And so you need this high degree of tension inside the country so that you can't get everybody on the same page, that there's so much infighting. So yeah, walk us through, because this really freaks me out, that we no longer make sense to think of us as Americans. Instead, we should think of us how?
As Democrat and Republican, or even better, as one's own tribe. Some people will say Republican or Texan or Christian or Bitcoiner or something like that. And first is just to level set, because, like, it's useful to quantify something, right? So if you look at this series of graphs, right, it's not one country, it's two parties. So basically, this is Congress, and an edge between two nodes is whether they voted together. In 1951, there's lots of bipartisan stuff happening in Congress.
Jesus.
In 2011, it was just totally a bipartite graph. And that's
Do we have
a
an
long-term
updated one?
Oh, it's
Like,
even more than
2018
that now.
or 2022?
This was 12 years ago, how partisan it had gotten at the leadership level, and it's even more aggressive than that, right? So this is a 70-year trend, right, where you can just see it gradually getting more. It's like mitosis. It's like a cell coming apart, right, for 70 years.
Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like. That's crazy.
And then it's visible at the individual level in a totally different kind of data set. So the previous one was like voting. This is social networks. And the previous one was leadership. This is the masses. This is from 2017. It's showing people friending each other, following each other on social networks, and red follows red and blue follows blue. And this was 6 years ago. Okay. It's gotten even more disjoint since then. Now blue has their own on Mastodon, and red is on, Gab or something. And so it's gotten even more disjoint in their own, rooms. Right. This study says that it's not just that Democrats and Republicans aren't friends with each other. Democrats and Republicans don't marry each other. 96% of Democrats are not married to Republicans. So ideology becomes biology in one generation. Right. This is
talk to me about
tribal.
the Sunnis and Shiites. This is like, hearing us referred to in that way was very eye-opening for me.
If you ever read the New York Times about a foreign country, it'll be like, in the arid steppes of so-and-so, tribes have fought each other for millennia. They'll kind of like, they'll have a gorillas in the mist kind of thing, right? But the level of conflict in the West now is tribal. It's Sunni Shiite, it's Hutu Tutsi. Once you kind of start applying that filter, it's only partially ideological. And one way of seeing that is during COVID, do you remember, like, there were like 4 flips? For example, at the beginning, Republicans were worried about COVID, and Democrats said it was racist to talk about the China virus. This is from like roughly January to March. Okay. Once Trump started acknowledging it and even saying something like, the virus is, we should shut down testing or something like that. Basically trying to downplay it at the time, Democrats completely flipped, and now they were saying it was a huge deal. And then they flipped to lockdowns, and Republicans flipped to libertarian. And then Trump pushed, Operation Warp Speed and so on through, and got the government out of the way for vaccine development. And if you remember, Kamala Harris said something like, I'm not going to take a Trump vaccine. And so at the time, the Democrat position was vaccine hesitancy. This has been totally memory hold. And then after the election, the vaccine was actually, held back until after the election. There's a guy, Eric Topol, who's talked about how that was like, there was a campaign or a lobbying campaign, like, to keep the vaccine back so, it wouldn't affect the election either way. Then it flipped again, and now Democrats were all for the vaccine. Okay. And then eventually it became something where Democrats kind of gave up on lockdown, and then the whole thing has gotten just sort of like forgotten. And I shouldn't say forgotten about, but memory hold or not discussed. So the point is, that's like at least like 2 or 3 or 4 flips, depending on how you count. Okay. And when you have flips like that, it's tribal, not ideological. Each tribe is saying what they, there can be some rationalization for each tribe at any given point in time. Oh, I didn't think it was serious, then I thought it was. Oh, I thought it was serious, then I realized it wasn't. And maybe there's some truth to that, but it's also something where A is taking a position because it's the opposite of B, and then vice versa, because it's just stick a thumb in the other guy's eye. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes.
The thing about that is, why is that important? It means talking about the United States is actually a misnomer. It's a disunited states. It's the individual states, and it's Democrat and Republican. And, it's something where, like, the flag itself is a contested symbol, where you'll find people saying, in New York Times just like a year ago or something, what did they say? It's like, The American
I had a friend
flag
that put an American flag up on his house, and I said, "Oh, that's going to get ripped down," and he was like, "Oh, it already
yeah, a
has."
fourth,
And I was
right.
shocked by
Okay,
that. It's
wow.
crazy.
Ouch. Yeah, 4th of
Yeah.
July, symbol of unity that may no longer unite. People make assumptions. So the flag is like a contested symbol, okay? And that was like July 2021. The point being that, I think the only thing that you can get super majorities, 99% of Americans to agree on is that they value the dollar, not the flag. That is actually it's an economic union like the EU, where the dollar is the last tattered piece of paper that's holding the thing together.
Whoa.
And like the EU has the euro, right? It's like an economic union, even though, right? So if there's like a serious currency crisis, which I think is coming, because we're already in a background of high inflation, with all of these crashes, they're going to have to print. That's a high level version of why. That printing will cause way more inflation. And then you have something, and you have options also, right? You have exits, you have alternatives, you have cryptocurrency, and you have foreign currencies, and you have other countries that are opting out and getting into gold or trading with China. The thing is that
do you think that helps or hurts the pull apart?
Well, that's it. I mean, helps. It accelerates in a sense, right? Because a person can pass away without any successor, but for a system to die, it needs a successor or multiple successors. Like, let's say for the Soviet Union to collapse, people had to have an alternative system they could look towards, that they would copy. And so people copied the US system, right? So when the Soviet Union went down, India moved towards capitalism and so on. China's the only one that didn't, right? It kind of kept its own system at the time. Not the only one. There are 5 communist countries that stayed communist, but China was a big one that didn't. Almost everybody else went into the kind of capitalist liberal democracy camp. So right now, what happened in March is really epochal, because you had AI going vertical, and that's a whole other massive storyline that's like an entire multiple podcast, whatever. You had AI going vertical. You had the banking crisis getting underway, showing how important this devaluation of bonds was. And you actually also had China going vertical, which is much more important than people realize. Do you know what I mean by that? China going vertical in March?
No, I was going to ask you.
This was just not covered in the Western press. It should have been blaring front page headlines and total focus on it. China developed a new muscle that I had not seen them flex. They had been kind of yelling and so on for the past few years. They developed the muscle of diplomacy, and they figured out how to get a peace treaty between Saudi and Iran, which is a huge deal, to get Saudi-Yemen war to stop, to essentially unify the Middle Eastern countries around Chinese, like China being the hegemon coming in. Like for example, they're forming like a unified navy in the region with Chinese input as a counterweight to the U.S. Navy. Okay, that's insane, like totally different than what you think of as Middle East, where everybody's warring. They're like all unified with each other, Saudi and Iran and China against the U.S. The U.S. has unified its enemies. You have even Iraq, like trading in yuan with China. You have the UAE trading in yuan with China. You have Brazil sending a massive delegation to China. You have Macron taking photo ops with Xi Jinping in China. And part of that is because, again, everything is connected, but the Ukraine war has caused such huge energy costs and other costs to Western Europe that Macron and France are dealing with like social unrest. There were the yellow vests a while ago, and now there's people protesting pensions and other things. So he needs wealth for his country. And you know what? China's can export stuff, and he can do economic deals with them. So that's why he's kind of part of why he's reaching out. The reason is he, has always wanted to put strategic autonomy for Europe. Then you have Southeast Asia, which is another contested region between China and the U.S. And the ASEAN countries are saying they're going to de-dollarize, and they're taking. They have their own skepticism in part of China, but they're taking money from China. And on and on and on and on. You have like basically the fact that China learned diplomacy is bringing also one more example. Zelensky went and took a call with China, and now Blinken, the Secretary of State, has said China may be a partner for peace with Russia, Ukraine. Okay,
how seriously do you take the de-dollarization?
I mean, basically, how seriously? I take it very seriously, and the reason I take it seriously is there's actually this great article saying China's unusual path to reserve currency status, right? and what's it called? The renminbi's unconventional route to reserve currency status. And this was actually, I'm pasting the link here in chat, and it was also written up in the Financial Times. And essentially, the point they're making, if you remember that graph would show that China traded with the rest of the world, right?
The terrifying graph that shows that, yeah, they've basically taken over most of the world.
Yeah. So a lot of people, the U.S. is so finance heavy that people will point to the dollar share of reserves and say, hey, that's still really high. Therefore, nothing is happening, right? But this is like pointing to, in my view, Soviet GDP. The USSR posted its highest GDP with its fake stats in the year of its collapse, okay? The difference here is all these countries are trading with China. So if you go away from thinking about in terms of finance and thinking about instead in terms of trade, all these countries that get hard goods from China will use yuan to buy those goods from China, right? So as, it's kind of back to the future. How did, the US didn't start as a financial power. It started as a manufacturing and export and trade power, right? And in a sense,
it's a very interesting note.
Go ahead, right? You see my point, right? So it's not that big a deal for those countries to flip over to paying China in its own currency and holding some of that currency to pay for their imports from China. And those imports just keep surging. So that's like the fundamental is, it's not trivial to replace the financial system, but remember my points earlier on how fintech and crypto talent all around the world, and people have launched currencies. There's countless fintech and crypto companies, payments companies, right? So that talent is there in a way that it wasn't in 2008. People know how to do that from scratch. Okay.
I want to lean into this moment, though. I think it's really important to, because what people are going to push back on there is they're going to say, okay, sure, they're doing a lot of trade in the yuan, but they're still reserving in dollars or storing value in dollars. Because they're doing that, it's never going to lose its status as a reserve currency. Because of that, we're going to be able to keep printing money. And also, and this will be big pushback, and this really resonates with me, and it's why I would not be putting any of my money into yuan. I don't trust the Chinese government not to seize it. So it's like, I get that countries are going to, for sure, they're going to do more trade with China. But if they're smart, they're going to keep them at arm's length. They're not going to overextend themselves. They're going to stay in the most trusted currency, which the question becomes, will the most trusted currency be the US dollar, given our very aggressive moves, certainly sanctioning the life out of Russia? That signaled to people that, hey, like, we're not afraid to weaponize the dollar against people. I think that's a terrible signal at a time where China is taking over a lot of the world trade. But I do have a feeling that people are going to be very hesitant to switch over from the dollar to the yuan. What say you to that?
Yeah. So that's why I was saying de-dollarization is decentralization. And so
meaning it's not going to break over to China yuan. It's going to go into Bitcoin as but one example, or maybe just scatter.
So you forget about Bitcoin for a second, right? So I think because it's a big world with 8 billion people, right? So after this thing fractures, you have, even if a few 100 million people pick an option, that's actually enough to do quite a lot with it, right? So first, let me just give some graphs to level set. Do you see this graph which shows foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries as a percent?
Yep. Total debt. Yep.
Right. So that peaked in 2013 and has declined quite a lot over the last 10 years, right?
Massively.
So essentially, massively.
What percentage drop is that? Do you know?
From 34% to 24%? It's like 10% absolute relative.
Yeah, sorry. It's too small for me to read the numbers. I can just see the arc.
Oh, yeah. So it's 34% at the peak here and 4% as of 2022. It's probably dropped off quite a bit more in 2023. So the point is that foreigners, when they're saving money, are not saving it in U.S. bonds in the same way. They're reducing their bond holdings, Japan, China, et cetera, okay? For the most part. There's a whole graph on foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries. So what are they buying instead? They're buying gold. So basically, they're not saving. So it's not just
this chart right here tells you something like this. This really is interesting to me. Now, I look at this chart and I expect the price of gold to have skyrocketed, but it hasn't, has it?
Well, so that's an interesting point, right? So basically, by the way, if you take this chart and the previous one, you can see as foreigners are buying less US Treasuries, they're buying more gold, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gold is a time-tested way of physical gold is a time-tested way of saving. But you can just go in as a foreigner, you can go and load in gold and get back yuan. And more importantly, you can put in yuan and get gold out. Okay. If that is true, China does have an open capital account in gold. Okay. And the thing is that not everything, not everything is necessarily reported. Have you heard my concept of like pre-headline people and post-headline people?
No.
So like a pre-headline person, think about a CEO or a researcher or a reporter, right? The CEO knows a product is going to launch. A researcher knows a study is going to be published. A reporter knows a story is going to appear. They know something is true before the headline appears. Make sense, right?
Very.
Whereas a post-headline person can only process something that has been officially acknowledged by an establishment outlet. Okay.
Yeah, I talk a lot about this as an entrepreneur. You cannot lead unless you understand the essence of the thing. If you understand the essence of the thing, now you can make predictions. You can move in a way where you don't have to follow people. That's right. A great point. Can I quote you quoting Elon Musk on this point really fast? You sure. Posted this tweet. I thought this was absolutely brilliant. So this is you like giving context for everything you're saying is going wrong. And Elon Musk tweeted, between Tesla, Starlink, and Twitter, I may have more real-time global economic data in one head than anyone ever. And then he goes on to say, Fed data has too much latency. Mild recession is already here. It's not like just the canary in the coal mine, SVB, died. One of the staunchest miners, Credit Suisse, died too, and the cemetery is filling up fast. So one, just sort of closing the loop on all the trouble and people seeing it, but reinforcing that point that you're making, that there are people that are able to accrue data, to form a worldview, to have a hypothesis on where this goes, and they're able to move differently.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's a lot of people nowadays who are like regime apparatchiks, who are just incredibly literal and, the term NPCs, right? Like just very much basically, so. Yeah, like anything that has not been published in an official source that they think like their Pravda is a conspiracy theory. Where's the source, citation needed, and so on and so forth. Like anybody, if you don't have, that's why I said pre-headline versus post-headline people. They are so literal that they cannot make logical inferences, right? And that doesn't mean it's 100%, but for example, not every single currency deal that China has done has probably been announced. People speculate that they may be doing gold deals behind the scenes with the Middle East, where that is a well-known, proven currency. And where do I think physical gold lands up this role? I'll come back to the gold price. The gold price is increasing, right? Where I think physical gold is something that probably returns as a state-to-state instrument. And maybe Indians in particular use it as an individual thing. Gold is still like a big thing in India at the individual level. But the thing about gold is, there's overhead of verifying it and validating it, and it can be spotted with a metal detector at the airport and all that type of stuff, right? It's like physically hard to carry. It's not modern in that sense. Still, as like a fire alarm, like as something that you can go ring, 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 and everybody runs out of a burning building and they converge on one spot that's like a proven spot before they go back to their homes or something. Gold's a pretty good shelling point. It's one of several shelling points. Bitcoin, I think, is another, right? A point being that people who take like the very first order approach, China doesn't have an open capital account, therefore I'm never, and certainly I wouldn't want to have a lot of holdings in the yuan, but people might keep a checking account in yuan to pay for their imports from China, and they have their savings account in gold or perhaps their local fiat or Bitcoin. That's what I mean by de-dollarization is decentralization. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Now, so we haven't talked a lot about Bitcoin, and actually do want to get a better understanding of where you think this goes. Sure. And we probably at this point need to get a peek into your future thing with American anarchy, China control, so on and so forth. But
sure.
So one of the things that you really grab people's attention with is this idea that Bitcoin will go to $1 million. Anybody holding Bitcoin sort of wants that to be true, but if you're anything like me, you also don't want it to be true, because you know that it just, the amount of brutality. When you put out that tweet, I said, I'll be a hell of a lot richer if that actually does happen, but oh my God, I hope you're wrong. So do you really see a path to Bitcoin going to $1 million, or is it just going to be one sort of small player in this decentralized fracturing of a whole bunch of different, whether it's coins or sovereign fiat that get a piece of the pie?
You see, in the Atlantic, the $1 trillion coin might be the least bad option. Why the legal scholar Rowan Gray thinks the U.S. Mint can defuse, and you see the United States of America, $1 trillion. Okay, and this is, now it wasn't actually pursued. Okay, but the fact that this got closer to being done or discussed. Okay, and it was defended by Krugman, and it was only rejected from a optics / tactical standpoint, because it might have
why $1 trillion coin? What?
Oh, you don't know about? Okay, so basically, because of the debt ceiling, evidently this was something that they had a rationale that this would be a workaround, and the Treasury could mint a coin of any denominations. Just, like they could just mint a coin and deposit it, and via some magic, the debt ceiling wouldn't be a constraint anymore on government spending.
I'm outright confused by this one. So I see $1 trillion coin. I assume somebody's kidding and they're just talking about hyperinflation, because it does make me immediately think about that.
Oh, you hadn't heard of this? Sorry, I thought you had heard of it.
If this is a meme, like what?
Have you heard of like modern monetary theory?
Yeah, I've heard of it, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
Basically, it's a group of folks who believe that the only constraint on the U.S. government's ability to print is inflation and taxation. Like, that is to say, they can and should print as much money as they want. It is something which is just a legacy, stupid constraint that we have a debt ceiling or whatever. It's essentially like, though they wouldn't phrase it this way at all, it's digital communism that says, because the government has guns, it can seize as much of your wealth as it needs to by printing money, and it can force you to give it back at gunpoint if you want, so it can redistribute all the wealth and so on and so forth. Okay. So people, which is true that it can digitally do that, and then the question is whether that breaks the illusion and people move to some other currency or whatever, right? At which point you get to difficult situations I'll get to. But this $1 trillion coin thing comes out of that school where they're like, we don't want to negotiate with Republicans over the debt ceiling. Instead, we will use this, thing in the legal code to mint $1 trillion coin and deposit it such that we don't have to negotiate with Republicans at all. It's almost like an executive order, right? The point is, though, that this creation of money, they're obsessed with it. Like, a lot of these folks are like, mint the coin, mint the coin. Krugman has talked about it. This guy on Bloomberg, Weisenthal, has talked about it. Rowan Gray has talked about it. It's in the Atlantic. It's taken seriously as a policy proposal, and it's gotten closer, since the last debt crisis. Whether it actually happens or not, it's symbolic of. Go ahead.
So the $1 trillion coin would go in somebody's bank account and allow them to
not a human's, but in like the government's bank account, and then it wouldn't need to raise the debt ceiling because it now has the money. It wouldn't change anything, is how they say. It wouldn't have any inflationary impact. I think I'm kidding. Just Google $1 trillion coin. See, that's the thing. What's good is the expression on your face. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make fun of them, but I want to pause before I do. That I'm going to assume that they're smart, well-meaning, well-intentioned people, but they really believe this is going to work. And so one of us has the wrong base assumption. So here is a law that I live by, and I really believe this is true. When two smart, well-intentioned people think the other is stupid, they have different base assumptions. Now, a base assumption is your belief about how you are and how the world is. And now, when you have a collision of values, it's a totally separate thing. And that's it's what you believe the world ought to be like versus how it actually is. So I believe, maybe erroneously, but when I hear $1 trillion coin, I have a base assumption that says, if you print money, you have what you're calling tax. You have robbed people of the buying power because of something mechanistic, not something philosophical, something mechanistic, that there is now more money, but no additional goods. And so the cost of the goods goes up because everybody's like so flush with cash that they will pay more for a finite pool of items. And so the cost of those items necessarily goes up to match the number of people just like throwing money at them. And so you think like, oh my God, I just got $1 trillion. But now your loaf of bread costs $1 trillion. And so yes, you have $1 trillion, but everything just costs more in proportion. And so you haven't gotten rich. Like I will just tell you, as somebody who went from normal money to rich in the refresh of a banking app because I sold a piece of my company, like that moment where you outstrip inflation, your life changes. Everything's different. You can afford different everything. It's just like, it's a really fascinating moment. But if my rent, like if somebody gives me $100 million, but my rent moves up in proportion, I may have $100 million, but I still have to live in the same apartment. I still have to have the same car. My gas proportionally has gone up. Food's proportionally gone up. So it literally doesn't matter. So what am I missing? Like, if really take their stance for a second, because I want to understand, like, they're not idiots. They may be wrong, or I may be wrong, but like,
okay, so there's a few different filters on it, right? I understand. So first is, conflict versus mistake. It's like, is this something where they're just making a mistake, or is it something where they're a different tribe and, the government tribe, blue tribe, wants to, attack Republican tribe or non-government tribe, right? That's one filter. The second filter is, the 50 IQ, 100 IQ, 150 IQ meme?
Yes, and love it.
Right.
But
so
usually said to make fun of something.
Well, yeah. So 50 IQ guys like, $1 trillion coin is stupid. 100 IQ guys like, no, and then gives this whole Krugman gibberish on why, like the $1 trillion coin won't be inflationary and so on. And the 150 is like, yeah, it's stupid, right? So there's like, this is kind of like CDOs or AAA rated subprime mortgages. The 50 IQ guy says, these people can't afford their house, so why are you doing a loan with them? 100 IQ guy has all this stupid, math or whatever that explains why, that that house is good. And then the 150 IQ guy can actually go into the math and rebut it and say, actually, when the default rate rises above X, then, your CDO crashes to Y and your CDS increases. So they can go in and plow through those abstractions and show why it actually collapses. But that's kind of what's, in my view, happening here. Now, one thing I will say is, I think a lot of the financial system is, quote, smart in the sense of like playing a 3-card Monty on people. They'll go like this. And the thing is that the $1 trillion coin is less clever than their usual kinds of illusions. When they do quantitative easing or the bank term funding program, that is set up to be hard to understand. It is like naturally selected and evolved to be understood. I can prove that to you.
Well, you proved this. I want to ask a very pointed question.
Yeah.
Do you think the people running the global, because this seems like a global problem, are the people running the global financial system evil?
So it's a really difficult question. I think some of them are evil. I think some of them are stupid. I think some of them are like Soviet. I think it's the close analogy is like Soviet apparatchiks, right? Let's just go to 2008 for a second. There was some mix of fraud, some error, some like spin, some tribalism, some pseudoscience, right? And different people did different things at the same time, right? Like the result was evil. Some of the inputs were evil. A lot of it was stupid, like financiers thinking of everybody else as dumb and what have you. So it's a mix. There's a way of thinking about it, which is good is helping somebody else without concern for yourself. Smart is helping somebody else while also helping oneself. Evil is harming somebody else while helping oneself. And stupid is harming somebody else while harming oneself. And I think a lot of the things the financial system does are, it's evil in the short run and stupid in the long run. Like they have a short-term gain by harming somebody else, but they spend down, especially recently, they spend down their trust. So they harm everybody in the long run. Like a lot of stuff they do with sanctions or freezing, deplatforming, censoring. That's not just the financial system, but like in the social system. It has a short-run advantage for them, the institutions that are doing this, but it's a long-run disadvantage because it actually reduces their power. But they're so short-sighted or short-term oriented, they only see that.
I'm gonna sort of refute my own point here. So, as you were saying that, I really want to believe that people are well-intentioned, that they look at this incredibly complex thing that is the economy. They look at the modern miracle that is the modern economy. When you look back at, tens of thousands, 20,000 years, that you realize that for a long time, the sort of capital markets that make capitalism work, they didn't exist. And so we've had this just Cambrian explosion of betterment for the world with innovation and all of that, because we really sort of master this economic game. Now, as Ray points out, you are in the middle of these big cycles, and when a deleveraging happens, it's really brutal. But if you don't care about any one generation, on the long arc of history, it's pretty amazing. And I've heard you talk about these helixes. So there is a sense of repetition in the way that societies move, but we are also moving up and we are making progress. And so that is, there's something very interesting there. So anyway, but when I look at that, I do say to myself, all of this makes a lot more sense once you know Nietzsche's will to power. And I do sometimes chastise myself for my really wanting to believe that the way that the global financial system is set up is well-intentioned people who maybe have gotten out over their skis a little bit, and they're really trying to do something wonderful and beautiful. But I do worry what I know about the Nietzschean idea of we all crave power to be in control of our lives, to be in control of others, to be the one with our hands on the stick, as it were. Because once I let myself bring in that bit of darkness, my predictive engine works better. And that scares me.
There's stupid and evil. There's also tribal. And if you remember the thing about, like, it's not one country, it's two parties, you know? The thing is, so, okay, if you just imagine like a Japanese guy was in Beijing and he just started suddenly knifing, 5 Chinese guys, okay, that would be a huge incident. That would be something that'd be considered a crime by the Chinese government, the Japanese government. The guy would go to jail, right? It'd be a huge thing. If that happened 80 years ago, right, when the Japanese were, invading China, the Japanese guy might get a medal, like bayoneting, like Chinese soldiers who had never met. And the reason is that was tribe on tribe, tribal warfare. So that act that we'd consider evil when those tribes were not at war would in fact be considered laudable when the tribes were at war. And that's like conflict versus a mistake. And so if you feel that the Republicans or the population at large or whatever is evil, then any deception or whatever, obviously the Allies deceived the Nazis during World War II. And there's all kinds of spy versus spy, deception, sabotage, et cetera, versus the Soviets. If it's another tribe, then people will do what they want to do. And what they feel is right for their tribe. They'll justify it that way, right? And a lot of that, the $1 trillion coin stuff, comes from make sure the Republicans can't hold us hostage, And in fact, if you see this article, Debt Ceiling Gimmicks, this is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the evolution of camouflage. Okay, there were 2 courses of action that he's stating were equivalent: minting $1 trillion coin and premium bonds. $1 trillion coin to even somebody without any finance or knowledge is just facially ridiculous. It summons a visual over here. Premium bonds, immediately people's eyes glaze over. Oh, that sounds maybe good, premium bonds, right? And now you need to go through a long explanation of what they are. But notice he's agreeing that they're equivalent in terms of their function. But natural selection selected against the $1 trillion coin because it's too obvious and it's selected for the premium bond in his kind of thing over here. Does that make sense?
But what it does, in that I understand the words coming out of your mouth, but I don't yet understand why a premium bond is actually like $1 trillion coin, because presumably
that's the whole
I
point.
buy a premium
you have
bond.
To go read this. You have to read this whole thing.
Give me the punchline quickly. But first, let me say, for those that don't understand bonds, so I'd be buying a bond because I think that it's backed by the U.S. government. I'm not going to lose my money. If I hold it to maturity, I at a minimum get my principal back, and I may get some sort of return for buying that bond. So 1%, in a low environment. So that seems okay, because you're asking me to give you my money. Basically, I'm going to loan it to you. I'm going to buy that debt. But you have to give me my money back. Whereas in $1 trillion coin, you're just making it up.
Yeah, but basically the point is, I can explain how premium bonds work, and this article does, but actually that gets us into the 100 IQ trap, right? Where the whole point is that Krugman is admitting that the $1 trillion coin and the premium bond are equivalent, but the premium bond is harder to explain, and that's why it's a more likely path. And this is exactly how the camouflage evolves. Do you understand?
Okay, let me see if I understand. Yes, I understand the camouflage part, but let me understand why. Yep. I'm going to take my best guess at why they are the same. They are the same because the debt that they create out of thin air. So I'm buying something that isn't real. I'm in a Wile E. Coyote moment of, hey, I said this is real. You can give me money. It's all good. And I'm going to give you that money back. And the reason I can guarantee it is because I will print the $1 trillion coin in order to be able to pay you back, because I'm just printing the money to make sure that I back that debt.
There are two different ways to work around the debt ceiling and have arguments that you're not actually violating the debt ceiling thing, but still essentially creating new money, right? And so that's like how functionally they're equivalent. I mean, you can read it, I can explain it, but the point is getting yourself mired in that complexity. I mean, you can't. Okay, what are they doing? They're issuing a new note with an interest rate that's far above market, and they're selling the debt instruments for more than their par value. Already, it's like eye glazing. You have to actually go and diagram this thing out, and that's the point. It's a vol camouflage. To give you another example, do you see this video clip that I pasted in? Mortgage-backed securities, subprime loans, tranches.
Basically, for anybody watching or just listening to the podcast, is basically that financial instruments are designed to confuse you.
Yes, this is a clip from The Big Short in a totally different context. The point is, you could headline it and you could say, hey, this number of people who got a mortgage like this have gotten bankrupted in the future, had to declare bankruptcy, or they lost a lot of money or whatever, because this teaser rate is actually a terrible thing, and your rates are going to go up and your payments are going to go up. Or they could say, look, our teaser rate, only $9.95, blah, 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 and they could just sell it, right? And so when the thing is, Wall Street and finance, as opposed to other sectors, like if you're producing, I don't know, bananas, you're selling the bananas and you're trading a good, right? The other person is buying the banana for consumption value and utility value, right? But when you're buying a financial instrument, I'm not saying that's always bad. Sometimes it's okay, right? But often at Wall Street, it's something which is zero sum. For example, you sell a stock and it's going to go up or down. And if it goes up, then the buyer is getting a better deal. And if it goes down, then the seller is getting a better deal. So each party, there's that question, which is like, how are you screwing me, right? That is what the Wall Street guys ask each other. You've probably heard that before.
I haven't heard it said like that, but that is not at all surprising.
Yeah, and the difference is that when you go and you buy a banana or whatever from the grocery, like nobody's screwing anybody, right? That guy produced a good, you gave some money, and both parties are happier, right? That's gains from trade. In the stock example, it's possible that you sell the stock and it goes up, but you need liquidity at that time frame, or I'm not pathologizing every single financial interaction like that. I am, however, saying that there's a greater degree of zero sum behavior there, much greater degree, right? And because of that culture has evolved, and the contracts have evolved. It's easily spotted. Okay, if it's obvious how Bank A is screwing Bank B, then Bank B spots it. You see what I'm saying? If, however, it's camouflaged in such a way, then Bank B doesn't see the fine print, but Bank A can be like, you agreed to X, Y, W, and Z. We got you, right? So each party is kind of weaponizing the contract system to try to fool the other guy into getting a worse thing. This was dramatized in the movie Margin Call, where, the guys were fooling their counterparties into buying these assets when they were saying that they were more valuable, AAA mortgages. You remember that, right? And so let me come back. So the point is, the financial system is set up to deceive you as to what it's actually doing. Hence, Bernanke, for example, years ago talked about how quantitative easing wasn't printing money, but then more recently Powell admitted that it was, right? Just to show you those two clips. Oh, I always try to have citations for everything I'm saying.
Yeah, man, I have to say that's one thing, like the way your brain works is terrifying. I don't know how you remember all these things, that they exist, first of all, and that B, that you can find them as quickly as you can. Yeah, I tweeted about that when I was researching it. I was like, what the hell? Your memory is prodigious. Funny. Is that like a thing you when you think about your own identity, is your memory being like freakishly robust part of your self-identity?
I don't notice it. It's like, I don't know. It's like your ears or whatever, something like that, right?
Funny you should pick ears. First of all, I notice my fucking ears because they are so big. And then second, I notice my memory because it is so shoddy. When I look at how much you reference, I have to believe that you remember a disproportionate amount of what you encounter, or you have a time machine or something and you have more hours in the day. I don't know, but it is.
Well, people always ask me, well, I just remember a little snippet. It's like a little hash, and then I can look it up, right? But partly it's kind of like I've got a story, and it's like a clothesline, and then I can hang things off of that, So it's almost like remembering song lyrics, and you can play it front to back, but it's not necessarily random access, prompted recall. Anyway, here is Bernanke once again explains why QE is not money printing. Okay. And then so they'll lie, or they'll dissemble, or they'll convince themselves it's not money printing because we intend to do quantitative tightening later. So we're not introducing into the system permanently, and you don't understand. You're not sophisticated, right? And of course, the sophisticated 150 IQ will say, well, you're never going to be able to tighten this Ponzi economy when you started. That's exactly the problem we're running into. We have had 20 years of just absolutely systemic economic fakery, okay? Just to give you some examples. Bernanke talking about how the, quote, great moderation, right, means that macroeconomic volatility is over, all right? Meaning, there's not going to be any more fight. We've solved macroeconomics. He was basically saying this in early 2000, all right? Cheney saying
the thing is, man, they really have gotten rid of that volatility. So my like central question is, does it break at some point? Because they really have reduced the amount of volatility tremendously.
I disagree. I mean, like just the 2008 crisis or the 2020 COVID, that's significant macroeconomic volatility.
Yes, but compare that to 1929, man. It's like it was devastation.
Okay, but like what he was talking about was there wouldn't be a financial crisis, right? That like he's like, we solved macro. There's no business cycle. That's what he's talking about.
Okay, there's no business cycle. That isn't true.
Let me give the totality of it. The Great Moderation, we've tamed macroeconomic volatility. Cheney saying deficits don't matter. Bush and Clinton blew up the mortgage bubble in a bipartisan way. I showed you those before. In April 2008, Bernanke says we might see a mild recession 5 months before the collapse of Lehman, and certainly 2008 was not a mild recession, right? Ratings agency in 2008.
Okay, so he said this before the 2008 crisis.
Yeah. That's my point. It could be a mild recession. That's not what it was. It was far, far worse than that, right?
Right.
Yeah. Here, the rating agency in 2008 calling this thing, the Great Moderation, was before the financial crisis. He was like, we killed it.
I still think he has a point, but fair. So if he's saying that before, when he's still like pounding his chest saying that there is no such thing as macro basically anymore.
He's basically saying we've solved macro, it's all done. It's a little bit like Rutherford saying we've solved physics, there's nothing left before quantum mechanics. It's like,
Yeah.
macro,
Fair. But
right?
I would like to quote Balaji for a second. So maybe
Sure.
you've heard of Balaji, right? So an idea that you have that I think is really brilliant is that okay, so give me fiat currency, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to rob from you constantly, but just a little bit. And by doing that,
yes.
I'm going to be able to keep it stable. So I think that what you're doing to the currency also applies to the macro economy. So I think that 2008 in any other time period is 10x that event that it actually was. I'm not saying that it wasn't difficult.
Sometimes, there's like, an evolved function of something where people don't know exactly what that institution is doing, and their verbal defenses of it are not actually what the function of the institution is. It's like, what does one of your organs do? Could you explain it verbally? It just does that, right? It's kind of evolved to do that, right? And your point is, you're actually citing me on this, and it's true, and I thought you might bring that up, which is one way of thinking about fiat is the dollar has had that long-term decline. The decline we're talking about, like the inflation cost of the dollar over time, right? It has a long-term decline in return for short-term stability, right? And like essentially what's happening is they're borrowing from the future, they're printing, you have this long-term decline of purchasing power, but it's like relatively smooth during the period, so you can plan on a short-term basis, right? And the thing about it is that's actually sometimes a valuable property, to have something that is flat and it's not going to oscillate that much in terms of its purchasing power over the short run, as opposed to something like cryptocurrency, which goes up and down percentage or whatever each day, right? Bitcoin has the opposite set of trade-offs in a sense, where it's appreciating over the long run, but has a huge amount of volatility in the short run. And you can imagine that you could have some flat coin where you embrace that as an engineering constraint, and you had a basket of goods and you had a reserve of funds, and you tried to maintain the price stability of that flat coin against a basket of goods, which you couldn't necessarily do if there was a true shortage. If you tried to maintain, let's say, the price of this, flat coin against grain, and suddenly there's a grain shortage, then no matter what you do financially in the physical world, that supply is gone. So the price is going to rise, right? But the point is, though, that yes, under some conditions, it's possible to have a long-term decline, but short-term stability, and a huge crash at the end, right? Do you know the concept of hormesis? Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yes. A little bit of bad does a little bit of good. It's interesting. I would not have expected you to bring up hormesis in this context. So do tell how we get there here.
So this is kind of the graph, so it's kind of like if you have too much volatility, you're dead, right? But if you have too little volatility, well, it's actually also worse than having some volatility that you can adapt to. It's like exercise. If you have too much exercise, you're dead. If you have too little, then you're
basically going to decline and die. Yeah,
that's right. But in the middle is kind of the sweet spot, right? And so what a lot of the system has done is, and this is actually a broader point, in many ways, we have the eternal Western present, right? Blue America is holding on to the present, while the tech libertarians are in the future and the conservatives are in the past, and the Chinese and so on are both like the future and the past. They think of themselves as like the Chinese empire, right? So the Western present is hanging on with its fingernails, and you can see it in the financial system, where it's like bailing out GM, and 400 something companies in the S&P have no growth, and they're all in tech, and they're trying to prop up these existing institutions. But you can see it also outside the financial system, where you have 70 and 80-year-olds running for president, and you have all the Hollywood remakes and Top Gun Infinity, and we're going to do a Cold War again. And it's all this stuff which is just referencing this increasingly distant, faded glory, and just trying to keep the current system together and to keep the present going for as long as possible without adapting to the future. And then you get just the whole thing just snaps and breaks, I think, right? And it just like, gets washed away. It's similar to, in my view, the current situation is similar in some ways to before World War One, where, you had, before World War One, you had the kings and the nobles, you had the monarchies, and yeah, there was constitutional monarchy, but there's still absolute monarchies. And that world seemed like it was eternal and it wasn't going away. And maybe it was changing very slowly. But under the hood, all these political movements, technological movements, industrial revolution, all this stuff was bubbling. And then in a cataclysm, like the modern world arose, right? And we kind of saw some of that during COVID. There was a lot of change that happened during COVID in a year. That became like the year that the internet, it was internet first, right? For example, every meeting now you can do a remote meeting. Digital currency rose, all kinds of things. There's like civil conflict in the U.S. I think in many ways, 2020 was a preview of what we're going to see in terms of, just like 2008, it's like a preview of what we're going to see. It's like an appetizer before a main course of a lot of change happening at once.
All right, you have a very clear thesis on this. What is the change? What does the future look like?
What does the future look like? So, I mean, I have a thesis, and of course, look, I could be wrong and so on, but and let me also give some optimism or whatever here. So let me see if I can say it in a few sentences.
Optimism or whatever.
All right. So the few sentence thesis is G7 countries are actually running out of money, and will attempt asset seizure in the future, whether through inflation or actual seizure.
That is so dark. Where's my optimism?
Okay, I'm getting to the optimism.
That's terrifying. I don't know that people understand like how gnarly seizure is. So first of all, I have family in Cyprus, and so watching this happen, where the bank's just like, we're taking your money now. Right. Crazy. Anyway, keep going. So there's going to be some kind of seizure. Agreed. Terrified, but agreed.
So the reason, whether it's via inflation or actually seizure, I mean, the reason is like, people didn't expect Dalio's Principles of the Changing World Order. It came out, I think, right before Ukraine and the rate hikes, and it seemed obvious that the path they were going to take was just going to be printing a ton of money. But sometimes the path they take is a non-obvious one, and it may just be hiking rates to the moon and just watching the system collapse and doing selective bail. We don't know exactly how the thing will unwind. Sometimes things surprise you, right? It's probably likely it's going to be printing. Point is, though, G7 countries are going to have a real problem, and they're going to be hard up for money. And then a lot of the world hinges on whether or not the G7 countries and China can seize digital assets. If they can, that's like one branch point in history. It means that you have like total states in the CBDC and so on and so forth. If they cannot, then you have a different branch point in history where it means that communities can now basically have digital gold or cryptocurrency and crowdfund bits of territory where they can have their own startup societies and eventually what I call network states. Okay. And then you'd go back to the future of something more like the 1800s, where you could get a plot of land and you could build a town or something like that. Or even, the Alaska Purchase, Louisiana Purchase, things of that nature, where their sovereigns would sell land. The branch point is fundamentally, will asset seizure be possible in the digital world? And the biggest risk factor for that is actually Apple, Google, and Microsoft, because they have operating system access. And that's actually, if I think about what I'm most concerned about, it is the fact that Apple has software update and Google can, get into your Google Drive, and Microsoft, has Windows. And if ordered by the state, in theory, they could scan your hard drive for private keys and then pull your digital assets. That is, to me, one of the most important problems that's coming up in the next X number of years. You might say, well, that sounds kind of crazy, Balaji. And let me see if I can motivate that a little bit. In 2010, remember we talked about the Arab Spring, right? In 2010, the Arab Spring had happened. And, people knew that Twitter and Facebook had been a component in literally like the overthrow of countries. They had political importance. Remember that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yet still, in 2010, 2011, if you had said in 10 years, the most important political issue in the world, or at least for a few days, will be whether the president can tweet, people would have laughed, right? Come on. Because they thought that social media's destabilizing political impact, that its political importance was something that happened elsewhere, right? That, really wasn't a big deal at home. We have a culture of free speech. Who cares? Twitter's still calling themselves the free speech wing of the free speech party. All that stuff was the early 2010s. Now, what's happened over the last 10 years, from basically, let's say the 2010s, is all politics became social media over the 2010s. And in my view, in the 2020s, all politics becomes crypto tribalism. Why? Because again, taking that Twitter analogy, just like you went from Twitter being acknowledged to have political importance to being the main event of all politics. And every politician is on Twitter first, and they think about Twitter first often as when they do something. They do a bill and they're thinking about it for Twitter, right? I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. I mean, Twitter didn't just, the 2016 election also really wasn't about Trump. It was about Twitter. Twitter was upstream. It elected Trump. It elected Bolsonaro. It got Brexit through. It was essentially a parallel media channel, and that's why those elections flipped. That's also why there was a counterattack on Twitter from 2016 to 2022, and it looked like the genie had been partially pushed back in the bottle, but now Elon then freed Twitter again, and we have digital glasnost. Okay, so with that whole story, where even as big as social media had gotten to hundreds of millions of users, billions of dollars, public companies, overthrowing governments in 2010, people still didn't think it was going to be the main thing for the president of the United States of America. With me so far?
Yep.
Okay. So in the same way, in 2023, where cryptocurrency is it's $1 trillion. It's hundreds of millions of users globally. It's quite a few billionaires, publicly traded companies, and even perhaps more importantly, every single bank, financier, government in the world has heard of Bitcoin. And many of them have launched CBDC programs in part or in whole motivated by the competitive threat of cryptocurrency. Okay. And El Salvador has adopted Bitcoin as a national currency, and Panama and I think Central African Republic are considering it. And so it's kind of like the Arab Spring in the sense of there's already a political proof point of cryptocurrency's importance. There's the Wyoming DAO law, there's the Tennessee DAO law, there's Texas saying Bitcoin shall not be infringed. There's all, Colorado accepts crypto for taxes, blah, 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 blah. There's all of this stuff that's happened. And yet still, if I said that in a few years, one of the most important questions in the world will be, does government have enough cryptocurrency to finance its operations? That still seems unrealistic. Okay. That's still something which seems distant. Oh, the US government is going to count how much Bitcoin it has, right?
The looming question, though, that I hope you'll address is some part of me is like, yeah, that sucks. I want the government to be able to print more money. So
sure.
Right. And
so,
the good news is I'm learning about this stuff. So enough of me is like sort of old school that I still remember being blind to all of this and enjoying the magic trick. And so it's just that it breaks at some point. Anyway, go ahead.
Today, if you look at Ben Bernanke talking about gold, or you hear anybody in the establishment talking about gold, it's with an eye roll. Like, oh, stupid gold bugs, right? Bitcoin, it's not taken seriously. Digital gold, it's just not taken seriously. It's thought of as maybe, if they're against it because they think maybe it's instability or something like that. But they don't think of it as like a threat in the same way they thought of Christianity as a threat or capitalism as a threat. You know what I mean? Or nationalism, those are things that they think of as a threat. Gold is thought of as a stupid curiosity, right? Not actually something that could disrupt the system. That's not how it was back in the day. 90 years ago, do you know like the most important thing in the world, basically 1933 to 1935, like front page news, like 9/11 or the financial crisis, was the gold clause cases. Okay. So the gold clause cases were essentially the question of whether or not the US government under FDR could essentially default on its obligations and say, the gold clause said the government will pay X amount of gold to somebody. If like a bond, it was basically a clause that was there to prevent inflation, right? I could ask for my payment in gold, essentially. Okay. And FDR passed an executive order, 6102, saying everybody had to surrender their gold. So that seemed to be incompatible with the bonds that had been signed well before that said the US government will pay you in gold, but FDR is saying I will seize the gold. Okay. So there's a bunch of cases of different kinds that all got collected, went to the Supreme Court. And this was like the big event of like 1935. Okay. Everybody cared about this. It's about a forgotten chapter in America's economic history. Okay. And it was a huge deal at the time. Okay. And the thing about it is gold was taken extremely, extremely seriously. Because they hadn't inherited the system. They were trying to build a new one. Fiat and gold were fighting at that time. So the thing about this is when you go back and you kind of read about that, you're like, whoa, it's just all gotten totally memory hold, right? The emotions on it have totally changed. Nobody even remembers it, right? And here, I want to show you something. Hold on. So
yeah, whenever you're pressing up on 100 years on something, the cultural memory is just not there. Nobody has emotions. Even grandparents have the emotion around that thing. And so us trying to capture that.
It's not necessarily true because remember, the Civil War, remember World War II, right?
Yeah, but none of that has real resonance anymore. Like this is going back to your very statement about when you have to found it versus inherit it. Even though World War II, we've got documentaries and stuff, nobody has a sense of like the greatest generation anymore. Nobody has a sense of what they gave up. I don't know if you've seen that video of the World War II veteran crying because he's like, the things we had to do, the people that died, the things that we sacrificed, and it's all for nothing. It's for nothing. Like that shit was heartbreaking to see that guy. That's a guy with memory of what it means to go to war, who watched the guy next to him get his brains blown out. Like imagine your friend next to you gets shot. There's brain and blood in your mouth from your best friend. That shit is very real to you. And so now all of a sudden, like, hey, what happens when things go wrong. So I do feel like that is a big part of it, to think that people from 1935 are going to have like some visceral sense of what it means when the government just like, I'll take your gold now. And, I know part of the punchline of this where it's like, I'm going to take your gold, I'm going to buy it back at whatever, 70 cents on the dollar. Or I'm going to buy it from you at 70 cents on the dollar. They literally just seize 30% of your wealth. It's bananas.
That's right. So, it's like a dilution of 70% by one measure. But yes, the cases dominated the news throughout the period. On January 13th, Elliot Thurston, wrote, rarely, if ever, has the Supreme Court of the United States confronted issues of larger import, 1935. On the morning after the decisions, the New York Times ran 5 front-page articles about them, and they were the overwhelming focus of the news and business sections. For perspective, the number of articles devoted to them more closely resembles that of historic moments like the moon landing or 9/11 attacks than it did other major Supreme Court decisions such as Roe versus Wade. Okay, the phrase gold clause appeared in more Times articles 49 on the day after than poultry, minimum wage, and abortion combined on the days after Schechter, West Coast, and Roe, right? Academics also touted the case's magnitude and import, right? And so, this has taken their place among the great landmarks of American constitutional history. So this is remarkable.
Dude, I think we're about to live through this again. I don't know what you think about this, but when I watch the posture right now towards crypto, this feels like capital controls in the making, that they're revving up. I mean, with the requested freeze of Binance US's assets. I don't know how that's going to play out, but man, that really starts to smack of like, hey, we're doing it to protect you. Don't worry. But like, PS, we're going to freeze your assets. It's like, what? I'm sorry?
That's right. So the thing is, the one of the macro frameworks I have is, while it's not exactly reassuring, it is that history is running in reverse. Okay. So if you think of 1950 as peak centralization, with one telephone company and two superpowers and three TV stations. You go forwards in time to 1991, the internet frontier opens. Backwards in time to 1890, the American frontier closes. Forwards in time, you have COVID-19. Backwards in time, Spanish flu. You go forwards in time, you have the tech billionaires. Backwards in time, you have the captains of industry, the robber barons, and so on. And this is true. There's lots and lots and lots of events like this. I've got like 50 of them in the Network State book. And they get really amazing and detailed. Like, for example, you go forwards in time, and China is a senior partner in the China-Russia relationship. You go backwards in time, and the Soviets, the Russians, are the senior partner in the Russia-China relationship. You go forwards in time, and you have an Indian origin and Pakistani origin guy debating the partition of the UK, because the guy who's the senior official in Scotland is a Pakistani origin guy, and the British Prime Minister is Indian. You go backwards in time, you have British origin guys debating the partition of India. Okay, you go forwards in time, and you have the New York Times siding with Ukraine against Russia. You go backwards in time, you have the New York Times siding with Stalinist Russia to choke out Ukraine with the Walter Duranty articles, where the New York Times covered up the Ukrainian famine, right? And that's like remarkable, where some of the same hinge points in history, so specific, are occurring again, but with the opposite outcome. A major one that's happening is there's actually a confrontation between journalists and founders, entrepreneurs and reporters in the early 20th century. That was like, Ida Tarbell and all the quote muckrakers went and attacked Rockefeller and all the captains of industry, demonized them, laid the groundwork for the trust busting and essentially the government to take over and quasi-nationalize a bunch of those companies with regulations and so on and so forth. And so Ida Tarbell and the journalists beat Rockefeller and the founders in the early 20th century. But now there's a similar clash that happened from 2013 to 2021 between the media and tech, the tech founders. But now it looks like the founders won that battle. On as Twitter, and we have the All In podcast, and we have all of these Substacks and so on and so forth, right? So we're seeing like some of the same confrontations or conflicts. It's almost like you've seen these really complicated origami things, and they fold and unfold, but you see some of the same faces as they unfold and fold. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Right. So I can't understand it all. This is such a huge thing that I can't pretend to understand this whole way that the world folds and unfolds in this way.
I'm going to push you on that though, because I've heard you bring this up a lot, and your punchline is always that there's something here, but I don't know what it is.
So the two hypotheses that I think explain this are, first, that centralizing technology was rising for hundreds of years, going into a peak in 1950. And so that's like, obviously the nation state itself, but I should say obviously. Most people don't know. I mean, do you know what was there before Germany and before Italy and before France? That's a mess. It does not look rational or logical from the standpoint of a map. And the reason is maps are actually, like sophisticated maps, are relatively new technology. That's to say, they weren't there for thousands of years, hundreds of years. A map is, think about how hard it is to make a map. You have to be able to travel long distances pretty quickly. You need surveying technology. Like a straight line on a map seems like a small thing, but there's like mountains and swamps and all this crazy stuff in between them, right? It's like map making, if you think about how you'd make a map and make it accurate, it's actually a pretty non-trivial thing to do, right? So on a map, this doesn't look, like all that rational. What it was organized by was not on the basis of the lands, but the minds, on the basis of communities of like mind.
What I hear you saying is that we have this constant tendency to bundle, unbundle. And so here We're looking at these different states that were unbundled for a long time. We have had a moment of bundling, and now as a part of the thesis around the network state, we're going to see this unbundling. Now, what I want to only in the West?
In the West. Yeah, mostly. And I think the reason is, I think the future is a decentralized West and a centralized East. Like the East, meaning Russia, India, China, but especially India, China, and then a lot of countries have gone through social communism. They're like on their state capacity increasing arc. things are getting better, like roads are getting better, highways are getting better, infrastructure is getting better. They're on their increasing arc. The closer you are sort of blue America and the G7, you're on like a declining arc.
That's
And
so crazy, man.
it's the opposite of the 20th century also. That's the other part, right? So the first part is centralizing technology. So just to continue my point, right? Why would we see this history running in reverse? Well, going into 1950, you had mass media, you had mass production, you had mechanized warfare. You basically had to control huge swaths of land and natural resources, and you had to team up to not get beat up, right? And that's why Germany was all these like little small principalities, but in part due to the Napoleonic Wars, like basically, you know the concept of roll up in business, like you take a bunch of small things, you roll them up into one conglomerate, right? That's what the nation state was. It was basically like, there are all these different groups in like the vicinity of what we now call France, and many of them didn't speak what we now call French. And after the French Revolution, they were all put together. They were all educated in the same language. They were unified in the same way. And this is actually, there are bad parts of the French Revolution, many bad parts, and people have written about that.
Namely the beheadings.
The beheadings and so on. But what people don't ask is, why did the left? How could it work in the sense of after all that internal chaos and anarchy? How could they generate a military that could just go and sweep over everything else? Right, to the same extent. Like
you had a strong leader. I'm very curious. Yeah, what do you think? Because researching Napoleon and his rise to power, this is my thesis on history, and people don't pay enough attention to history as a PSA. When you have like the bundling, as you were showing Germany, I was like, yeah, the only way to bundle that mess is if you have a strong man that comes in and like starts throwing his weight around, and he's more intimidating, and he'll like. He's creating order, so let's not discount that. So he's bringing order to something, but I'm going to guarantee that he's doing it in a way where some people are just getting their necks stepped on. Like even how Napoleon came to power, it's like he was truly a military genius, and so he could go in and bring the riches back. And so people are like, whoa, maybe this guy's better than we thought. And as soon as he started losing, then he was ousted. But if you're on a tear and you're able to intimidate, back down your own people and go abroad, steal riches, win wars, man, now let's really get into the crazy stuff. The fact that Hitler, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, fascinating book. Everybody should read it. The fact that he was able to talk, oh God, what was it called? Czechoslovenia. Oh God, I forget the original name of what is now the Czech Republic. Always, for some reason. He talked them out of their country. There was no shot fired. He just literally talked them out of their country. So anyway, it can be a pretty dark period when you unite the bundling process.
Here is something that might complement this view on the strong man part of it is definitely a piece of it. But this is actually something I feel the right has a blind spot on, which is to say that, and these are broad generalizations, right? But typically the right thinks about things in terms of heroes and individuals, and the left thinks of things in terms of institutions and ideologies. So you don't just, the thing is, for something like, Napoleon, and at least my thesis on it, look, I'm not a historian of the Napoleonic Wars, but what I think about it is, it's not just that there was a strong man, there was a strong ideology. What I mean by that is, Napoleon, in a sense, benefited from the fact that the crazies of the French Revolution, while they'd been crazy, they had unified France, and their propaganda, they had, essentially rationalized this whole thing. They'd smoothed it all out, and everybody was under, the control of this centralized government, and so the base of all these people who had been propagandists. I should go and I'll double check, all the things on this afterwards, but essentially that was something. It's a little bit like Mao did a lot of terrible things. I shouldn't say did a lot of things and unified China, right? So
yeah,
he did a lot of terrible things and unified China.
Shocking, but true.
And he smoothed out all of these issues and so on and so forth. And then a right of center person could come in and Deng Xiaoping is capitalist, and then take that unified thing and then implement capitalism on top of it. And it turns out that it's kind of hard to unify a gigantic swath of land without using both left and right tactics, because the right is like economics and the military, but the left is like propaganda and ideology, and even though it's not called this way, religion, right? It's like the software that all these people are running in their heads. Why do they think of themselves as being part of the same people? Well, you educated them and you brainwashed them and you instructed them and you taught them and you made them do X and Y and Z. And the thing is, normally the right libertarian thinks about everything in terms of, okay, here's a fair trade, you pay me X and I'll pay you Y and so on. But the left authoritarian thinks, I'm not going to pay anybody anything. They're just going to do it. And you know what? If you can pull it off, it really, really scales. Right? Like, you have no unit cost. Everybody installs the same software in their head. They're all basically educated to do the same thing, and they have to do it, and you're not going to pay them. And in fact, they're going to pay you, right? If you can pull it off, you can unify this absolutely gigantic swath of territory, right? And that's a really important component of it. It's not just, the warriors, it's the priests, it's not just the swords, it's the words. You need that kind of unifying ideology. And I recognize it's an idiosyncratic way of thinking about right and left. I talk about this at length in the Network State book. But that's why it's not enough to just have a strong man. What I mean by that, just to take a reductio ad absurdum, I know it's not the sense in which you mean it, but if you just have a guy who comes out of a weight room, he's a strong man, why do people follow him, right? He has to actually be a leader in some sense. He has to have the ability to run an organization. He has to have some motivating ideology. This is also in the kind of small version of this. It's not that small, but like somewhat small, is like a founder who's got a vision for changing the world as a company, right? Yes, they have the right aspects of hierarchy and capitalism and meritocracy or whatever, like stereotypically right. They also have the left aspects of a mission and like often an egalitarian dress code, and we're all in it together against this, oppositional kind of thing, like an insurgent or revolutionary movement, right? Which have historically been left things. And so I think you kind of need both. And anyway, coming back up. So point is that for 500 years going into 1950-ish, you had this centralizing tendency. And this was something where you had small city-states couldn't compete. In fact, one way of showing that, the exception that proves the rule. Do you know this country called San Marino?
Oh, yes, I've heard you talk about it. Yeah, that was a protectorate of like a guy who becomes king and then he lets them keep their...
You really have done your research. That's right. Yeah. So so Garibaldi, when he was unifying Italy, San Marino, at least as the story has it, gave him refuge. And so he let them be sovereign. And so you can see like this duck-billed platypus, this missing link that exists to the present day. San Marino is like a piece of what the past was. Okay. And it's like surrounded by Italy. It clearly is like, it's like 30,000 people or something like that, but it's maintained its sovereignty through the years. And you're like, oh, why is that not just a piece of Italy? It's like a tiny town, really, in Italy. It's a totally fine place or whatever, right? And their UN membership is very valuable to them and whatnot. But now you're like, oh, okay, that's what the old world was before all got rolled up into these gigantic centralized nation states. Part of why things get rolled up into nation states is defense and production and scalability and so on, all these centralizing tendencies. Okay. And so what you got in 1950 was a very atypical thing for the whole world. Like, you had this gigantic American empire with hundreds of millions of people, and you had the Soviet Empire with hundreds of millions of people, the Chinese, India. These were just like a relatively few number of states. And many of them were running like just two operating systems, right? Capitalism and communism. So it's a very, very, very centralized world with lots of the, differences of different cultures and so on, all just got steamrolled, paved over. And the best version of that was everybody watches I Love Lucy in the US at the same time on the same channel, and they're all like just the same softwares installed in their heads. I Love Lucy, like this, right? And the worst is, like Mao's Little Red Book or, like Hitler or Stalin or something like that, right? That's like, just the propagandizing, right? And so, point is that right around that time, what's interesting is sometimes at the very peak of something, something is invented. So, transistor was invented, right? And so you go from transistor to the computer, mainframe, and then the personal computer, and you have cable television, and you have the internet, of course, and the smartphone and cryptocurrency. And for the last 70 odd years, we've been in a decentralizing arc that is faster, in my view, than the centralizing arc.
Is the decentralizing arc, is that pathological? Is it a breaking apart inappropriately, or is there something good here? Because you have a picture of how this can become good, but it feels like it's born out of rot, if I'm completely honest.
It's both and, right? It is something where, like, for example, Blockbuster is an example of a company that was set up under a certain set of technological assumptions, like home video rentals and so on, that turned out to just be a window in history that was within our lifetime, and it rose and it died, right? It rose, when it was a technological pioneer on the basis of like home VHS, when that was a breakthrough, and then it fell once streaming became possible, right? We saw that within our lifetimes. With me so far, right?
Yep.
So you think about the giant centralized state, and it's like Blockbuster, where there was a point at which it was riding the curve of technological innovation, and it was just crushing everything in its path. And now the technological wave is against it. And those ideologies that seemed unstoppable when the technologies favored them, those organizational structures, for example, Blockbuster had physical stores all around the country, and it had late fee policies. Its entire business model, its organizational culture was based on this DVD that you come back home. It had popcorn that it sold, right? All that stuff gone with Netflix. Netflix doesn't sell popcorn. Netflix doesn't have in-person stores. Netflix just streams the video to you. It doesn't have late fees. Every aspect of the business model got just totally destroyed by technology, and we saw that in our lifetimes, right? And you just now have to take a wider lens, and you think of that happening not just to companies, but to countries.
To hear more about Ray Dalio's warning on the upcoming recession, which we're almost certainly already in, watch the full episode here. Talk to me about the three forces that you see that are influencing this moment. We've got banks collapsing, US dollars under attack, looming recession. What